Hello. It seems that coffee break has finished and that you are all gathered here. I'm very happy to announce our invited plenary speaker of today, Professor Frede Hvelplund. Did I pronounce that well?
Surprisingly well.
We have also some difficult phonemes. He is a professor in energy planning at the Department of Planning and Development, Aalborg University, Denmark. His background is economics and social anthropology. I was talking in the introduction of the importance of wider view, and here now we will have a wider view. He has written many books and articles on socioeconomic feasibility studies and the transition to renewable energy systems. Amongst others, several alternative energy plans written in interdisciplinary groups together with engineers. He is a concrete institutional economist and understands the market as a social construction that for decades has been conditioned to a fossil fuel and uranium-based economy. Hence, a transition to a renewable energy economy requires fundamental changes of an array of concrete institutional rules, laws, and market conditions. As a consequence of this understanding of societal development, he has written several publications on the innovative feasibility study methodology which will be used in the SUPER project. In 2005, he obtained a Danish Doctor of Technology degree, which is a second doctorate degree, if I understand the Danish system well. And in December 2008, he received the Aerosolar European Solar Prize in Berlin. Fred, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for being invited. I'm very glad to be able to say something about consumer ownership, national monopolies, and green energy transition. And I think the way we organize the energy system really means something for whether we get money enough for the transition. Whether the money goes to, you could say, big gains in a large company, or whether it goes to lower prices for consumers. So consumer ownership gives economic space for the transition. And this is, in Denmark we have 60% district heating, which are consumer owned or municipality owned. And we have the whole direct electricity system is consumer owned and municipality owned. There was a small change in 2004 where the power plants were sold to the two state-owned companies, Vattenfall and Dong. But the national monopoly part of the Danish electricity system, which means the distribution operators, is consumer owned and municipality owned. So this, I think it's important just to see what an electricity system is. And if you produce 100 units electricity, where does the money go in a fossil fuel system? And very quickly said, 1/4 goes to fuel, and then a lot of money goes to the equipment produced for the system. And then we have the consumer-owned system, which is the power plants, the transmission system, and the distribution system. And this system is then buying fuel and equipment. So the consumer-owned part of the fossil fuel system in Denmark is having the initiative, but they don't have the biggest part of the value added. So, and I think it's worthwhile to mention and the division between the direct electricity supply system and the indirect electricity supply system, where the indirect system is producing the equipment for the energy system. And there has always been some competition down here. And what I have to go very quickly with this, and I hope to be finished in 45 minutes so that we have some time for discussion. And this is a price showing the EU average price of electricity which is this level, and then we have the Danish price for small industry at this level, around 25% lower than the EU average. And this price includes also payment for new renewable energy subsidies. So that Danish price here includes some payment for wind turbines and for biomass plants needed for the whole system. And so it is very important to see that we need a system where there is money for the transition. And the consumer-owned system saves money for the transition, you could say. So the consumer owner, and this is a very short way of saying it, the consumer municipality ownership combined with non-profit public regulation. So you have consumer ownership of the system, and the government says you are not allowed to take money out of the system for other purpose than for your electricity production purposes. So that's a non-profit, you call it. In a way, it's a wrong word because it is consumer profit, because the consumer owns it, and once the company cannot give money out for other purposes, all profit goes to the consumer in the form of lower prices. And if this consumer system works, then this will give low prices. This is not only in Denmark, it's something that also would be the case in other countries in the world, because you have a regulation of a natural monopoly where you have the consumers that want low consumer prices, and you have a government that tells you you cannot take profit out of the system. This makes earlier introduction of renewable energy possible. And this is what we heard yesterday, that sustainability also needs low prices and cheap ways of doing sustainability so that people can afford it. And consumer municipality ownership under this non-profit regulation makes earlier introduction of renewable energy economically viable, and has made it in Denmark. So in natural monopolies, and that's like companies that have a grid system where you cannot just elect another grid system, you have to use this grid system. Then consumer municipality ownership in a non-profit regime paves the road for renewable energy. And I think this is not just in Denmark. It's in the whole world would be the case that when you have a natural monopoly, you cannot regulate it from a distance. You can only, I would say this, and that's good for discussion later on, I think you can only make a really good regulation by having a sort of consumer ownership. Because the consumers don't want to cheat the consumers. Maybe they want to cheat each other, but they don't want to cheat the consumers as a group. So in natural monopolies, consumer ownership and municipality ownership in a non-profit regime can pave the road for renewable energy and make sure that renewable energy and the transition to green energy technology is not getting too expensive. And then I'll just say a little bit about electricity distribution companies and the transition. And the question is, in fact, I already have answered the question here when I hear my voice saying it, how to make a regulation system that produces innovation and low prices and gives space. And I would take the present Danish regulation of distribution companies. And the first thing I will mention is, when you look at governance philosophy, how you regulate natural monopoly, then there are different dimensions of government. You need to have a democratic communication so that there's openness of information. You need to have some buying power regulation, but you cannot really do it, but you can only buy from one grid system, so there's no real buying power. And you could have state regulative power, and this is what often is used internationally. But what is the best, to my opinion, way of regulating is consumer ownership power, because that's the only way, I would still say the only way, so that's good for discussion later, as mentioned, the only way you can regulate a natural monopoly efficiently through consumer power and municipality power and a non-profit regime. Because if the government regulate, you have asymmetry of information. You don't know what you regulate sufficiently. So you make regulation mistakes, and people that regulate are later on getting jobs at big companies. And so you cannot really control the system from a state distance. But if you have a well-functioning consumer ownership, you can regulate it. So remember, you have different ways of regulating a natural monopoly. One is through the buying power, and this is very weak in a natural monopoly. There are a few ways you can do something. And then state, you can do something, that's the most normal thing to do in the world. And then you have consumer ownership power, which is the strongest regulative power, and then all of it has to be performed in a world where there is openness of information. So if you don't have openness of information, you cannot, nothing functions. But that consumer ownership is the best way of regulating natural monopoly is not in the textbooks. They have a blind eye on this subject. And that's a rather problematic thing to have when it's the best way of regulating natural monopolies. So this is just a distribution. Sorry for the one sitting in the back, but I'll say what it tells you. You can see the two colored boxes. They're just the transmission system and the distribution system. And you can see the color, you cannot see what's written in them, but I'm saying it now. And then you have a top-down regulation of these two systems. But then you have the most, according to my opinion today, the most important regulator is consumer and municipality ownership. So you have a bottom-up regulation through consumer ownership and a top-down regulation from a state. These two things together so the state tells you, okay, you are not allowed to have the price higher than this. So they mention a ceiling on the price, and then you have the consumers that want low prices themselves. And that's interesting, but I will not go in detail with it, but it is, in fact, interesting that the state regulation the ceiling is higher than the level of these companies find themselves in their consumer ownership. So there's a difference between the ceiling and the state-defined ceiling. Okay, you can take 6 euro cents per kilowatt hour, they might say, but the consumer will go down maybe and only use 5 euro cents, and then there's 1 euro cent in the profit in these consumer-owned companies. And that's interesting. I didn't know it when I started to analyze it, that this double regulation had this effect. So, and I would recommend you to go and take a look at this link, and I hope you'll get some slides later on. I could have showed it here, but don't think the system here works for showing it. And it is, in fact, interesting. I was surprised when I saw it in this company, Energy. That's a company with 210,000 consumers, 100 consumer representatives, and then they elect 9 board members, and then there are 2 more board members from the employees, 11 altogether. And when you go on this link, you can just see how the election works. You can see Kirsten Sørensen, a person, saying, I want to be elected for this representatives, one of these 100 consumer representatives, and I go for more green energy, I go for cheap energy, and I go for energy conservation. And you'll be surprised to see all this vivid, lively communication of these on this homepage. And I was, as mentioned, surprised, although I thought, okay, consumer ownership is a nice idea, but it's on the way out. In a way, I had this feeling a little bit. But in fact, with the homepage saying the electronic openness of information, you can have a more lively discussion. So the consumer ownership in this company has increased its activity after new technology has been introduced. So you can go and see the homepage, there's discussions and so on. And you can also, and that's on the next, you can go and see which green projects do they have in this company. And I mentioned you before that the public ceiling could be 6 euro cent, and they themselves have only a ceiling or a cost of 5, so they have some money to deal with. And that's interesting because these money are motivating people to participating in the consumer ownership system because there's something they can do. So there are several projects. They have wind power plants. They have also green city projects from this money. And so this is what you can see a lot of green projects and some really surprising projects also because they also use money for social sustainability. For instance, gender equality, they have one box on this, and they use money for teaching, improving the schools, teaching in climate and so on. And you can go and see it, and I'm sure most of you can speak and read Danish. So that's very easy. Just go on this link and read what they are saying. At least you can see the faces of the people who are in the want to be member of the representative committee group. So, as mentioned, the surplus from the regulation, you could say the 6 minus 5, is used for green purposes. But nevertheless, this is not enough because when I analyze the green projects, there's no really green projects where they deal with integration of energy. Maybe this will come later on, I don't know, but so far there's not. And you should know that consumer ownership in these, I mentioned this energy, this is one with 200,000 consumers. Then you have another one in South Jutland with, I think, 400,000 consumers, and on Zealand another consumer owned with 350,000 consumers. You can go and take a look at them at their homepages, but the projects so far are mainly projects like subsidies for green cities, maybe some subsidies for electricity, transportation, infrastructure, and for energy conservation and so on, but not so far for integration of fluctuating energy, which Nevin talked about yesterday as one of the main problems. So I'll say a little bit about integration from now on. The big change is, as you all know, from stored fossil fuel to fluctuating renewable energy. So you go from a place where you can, from a system where you can use it whenever you want, to a system where you have to take it when it is there, and then transform it for the consumers in one or another way. So as a consequence, you go from sector-based fossil fuel system to integrated smart energy system based on renewable energy, and not to forget energy conservation. And if you take a look at this linked to the value added, and I think the one sitting at the bottom in the room cannot see what is in the bottom. So that's a problem, that you cannot see the smart energy system, because that's the most important thing here. But you can only see the fossil fuel system. Sorry for that. You have the fossil fuel system in the top, and you can see we still have consumer ownership of all the natural monopoly. Yes, the transmission is a state-owned system, but distribution, which is a big system, is consumer-owned. But then this is transferred to the bottom, and I'm sure you'll get the slides. But I can say what is disappearing, and then you can have a sort of feeling for what is left. This is what is disappearing when you go from. What disappears is the power plant production, fossil fuel power-based production, and fuel. And this, what is left is then mainly a transmission system and a distribution system, and then the indirect electricity supply system. So you can see there's an arrow down there, but you don't know what the arrow points at. But I can tell you the arrow points at the transition to integrated smart energy system. From these, you put a cross here, they disappear, and you have to go down to an integration system. And what is characterizing this change? The fossil fuel part is being removed. The central power plant section is reduced. The indirect part of power system is increased by replacing large fossil fuel power plants with energy automatons like photovoltaics or wind turbines produced at factories, not produced in electricity systems. So you go away from a big value-added in the system, in the electricity system, to a big value-added on the factories producing the energy automatons. And the value-added share of the old power system is almost disappearing. And the old power companies are searching for centralized interconnection solution with ownership of consumer-distant renewable energy system. So, and that's a long story, and I cannot tell it today, but and we don't have time for it today, but there is a big fight going on just now between different solutions. And it seems that there is a tendency that the big power companies, they want to build interconnectors and own large offshore power plants, wind power plants, and alternative to integrate energy is in a competition with this road, you could say. I would call this the power plant transition or interconnector road for a 4-track blind alley. It's easy to drive there, but it is a blind alley, and the large power companies want to go this way mainly. And this is just a smart energy system, and that's one of the slides where you still, sitting in the back, cannot see this smart system. But it is mainly just saying that wind power has to be packed into a system where you have heat and electricity and heat integration, you have transportation and wind and electricity integration, you have wind power producing syngas, and you have and not to forget energy conservation. I'll not rest a long time at this figure, as many of you can only see the top of it. And then I can say what it is about these infrastructure technology. The base of integration is a consumer and municipality-owned district heating infrastructure. This is the fundament. A lot of consumer-owned distribution system and heat systems. And then you need low temperature district heating. Many of you know about this. I worked with this. Wind power for district heating in combination with heat pumps and hot water storage. You need geothermal energy. In many places you have it. We have a few places in Denmark where we use it. And this is low temperature. You need solar energy for heat, and there are many places where you do this and have a seasoned storage system. You need low temperature industrial heat, or you have low temperature industrial heat, and you need go for 40% heat conservation, which is often forgotten, talked about, but forgotten in reality. Wind to gas system, which I don't know much about, but my technical leagues know a lot about it, and you know a lot about it, some of you. And then wind transportation infrastructure. And why do I mention all these things? It's because we have to paint a picture of the nature of the change. These are the types of technologies we need. And then you can see, finally, you can maybe see the smart energy system, the transmission, distribution, and then an integration infrastructure, and then fluctuating renewable energy. All of this is made on factories and then supplied to people. So the indirect electricity supply system has increased, and what is left is transmission and distribution. So these two things have to be increased, both the integration infrastructure and the energy conservation and household investment structure. So we are dealing with a shift from a consumer distant to a consumer near integration system. All these technologies are much closer to the consumer than coal mines, shipping system, and the central power plants they replace. That's the important message. They are much closer to the consumers. And I think Nevin mentioned these problems in his presentation, that it is a problem that the new system are not fitting very well to the old organizations. And who should then own the 100% renewable energy, smart energy system? There are two, but I will not say much about this. There are the smart energy system road, as mentioned, with integration, as mentioned, between heat, transportation, and so on. And we still need some large grid transportation system, and you then have local ownership and regional ownership as a normal ownership structure. And the alternative is smart electricity sector road, which I, as mentioned, think is a 4-track blind alley, which I will not analyze today. So large, and this is difficult to read, to see, but there were so many things I had to have on this slide, so I excuse very much that it's so small letters, but I'll say what's written on it. If large companies should enter this market, how much time do I have left? 15, okay. Fine. So I think I can do it in 15 minutes. So if large energy companies should deal with this integration, they would probably need to buy the local consumer municipality-owned district heating system. This would be very difficult as these companies are non-profit, consumer profit owned, you could say. They would have to invest in the right size of heat pumps and the right size of heat storage system linked to a district system owned by municipality and consumer, or to make sure that these investments are implemented in time. A multitude of coordination activities should be developed, dimensioning investment in the different technologies so that they supplement each other and concurrently establish the right amount of energy conservation at the right time with a conservation level that supports the right low temperature district heating system. So there's really many things they have to deal with, which are very difficult to do from a distance, but not that difficult to do if you are owning the district heating system and owning the houses. And the last. So it is difficult for distant owners to establish near shore, and it also is difficult to establish near shore and onshore wind power, as local citizens want influence and benefits from energy plans to counterbalance inconvenience from such plans. And as distant owners, like, for instance, the Swedish Vattenfall, don't pay any tax for the municipality. So these systems are very it's difficult to get a local to accept distant ownership, and difficult to get local ownership. So there are many places where you have a sort of stalemate and no solution, because these two groups are stopping each other. And also distant owned offshore might meet resistance from regional actors and from environmentalists. Cooperative ownership with funds for nature could be a need also for offshore. And then I would say, take the middle. The coordination is much easier for households and for district heating system, and because they can make all this coordination as we thought about. Therefore, it's a valid hypothesis that a complex coordination and integration task can, at the investment and operation and management level in smart energy, may have to lower transaction costs in a decentralized consumer ownership model than in a centralized distant ownership governance model. I hope you got all these words, but at least you know the meaning is it's much easier when you are close to coordinate than when you are far away from the thing you should coordinate. Then policies. I think that's the last main point. So you need to find policies for this integration. And so you need policies, and this figure is just saying that you need policies for renewable energy, but you also need policies for the integration structure for the renewable energy. And the first phase, until a few years ago, it was enough to have incentives for renewable energy. But now you need to find the incentives for the integration system, which we don't have sufficiently, not either in Denmark. And local ownership, why do this? Keeps integration transaction costs low, keeps heat prices and electricity prices low. That's the experience we talked about before. So we need local ownership also in order to keep prices down. And it gives increased incomes in windy areas, which are often hinterland areas, and it reduces local and regional resistance. So there are many reasons, and you can read them. And then I would say, I'll say it very shortly. In the EU, they should have a policy where they say it's important to integrate energy before you build interconnectors. And once you have integrated as much as you can, then build interconnectors. That's needed. But this is not being done now. We build interconnectors and transition lines between countries before we know how much we can integrate locally and regionally. And this is costly economically, because you don't do things in the right order. So I would suggest, and this is one of my last slides, so I would suggest implementation at the EU level of a subsidiarity principle, which means that as long as you can integrate locally by integrating heat and electricity and transportation, electricity and syngas, as long as you can do this, you should not build interconnectors. And the same level, and then you need to have the same level of subsidies for smart energy systems as you now have for transmission energy systems. And as you know, and some of you know, you get a lot of money if you want to build a line from Denmark to Cobra, to the copper cable from Denmark to Holland. I don't remember the exact amount, but it was around 10-20% of the investment. But you don't get any money when you build infrastructure in order to integrate heat and electricity. And then EU should have a clear, it's a little bit unclear whether they accept it, a clear acceptance of policies that support local and regional ownership of majority shares of renewable energy system, and by this I mean more than 50% should be allowed. It's difficult to know whether it is allowed now. It's a question of how EU interpret the word for the common good. If it is necessary for the common good, it is acceptable to have a national legislation that says any wind power or solar projects should at least have 50% local, regional, consumer municipality ownership. And then for Danish policies, it's interesting for Danes, but it might also be interesting because it's a general. In Denmark, we don't have the same tax on wind energy as for biomass, which we have 0 tax on, so we should remove the tax on wind power for heat. And we should have a systematic conservation policy, and I'm sure this is, I know that we don't have this in Europe in general. The energy it's surprising that we can have unemployment of young people, 30% in Southern Europe, and don't have a massive amount of house improvement projects, because unemployment is a resource, not a problem. And it's you could say it's fantastic that we have 30% unemployment, because then we have the capacity to solve some problems. It's horrible if nobody are ready to solve it, but we have this now. So heat conservation and heat house improvement should be done massively, and also here in Sicily, I heard you had I think it was 30% young unemployed young people, and then a requirement of at least 51% local and consumer ownership of wind power onshore, and it should be kept in a lifetime of the plant. So you cannot just escape from it by saying, okay, day 1, 51, and then you sell everything to Vattenfall or to someone else. And then at least 51 cooperative ownership of offshore, also offshore power plants. It's not a holy thing that this should be owned by AON or by EDF or by Ørsted or by Vattenfall. And then a requirement of a 30% tax for local and regional environmental purposes. And I think offshore wind turbine should also be taxed in order to protect the environment in the sea. And then wind turbine ownership should be given preference to district heating company that makes integration system. And then my last slide is what we don't have time for, and it's inspired by Nevin. He said we have 3, or was it 4 years? 4 years. So we don't have time to make fundamental mistake like no local acceptance, no local ownership, and product delay. We have to tell Vattenfall, EDF, AON, all these companies, now it is time to make projects in together with local owners. And they should accept that that local owners have the ownership majority. And if I was director of Vattenfall, I would do this happily, because if I was the first company coming with a project's philosophy of majority local ownership, then I would get all the projects in the world, much more than they get now. And it's a sin not to start, because it stops projects. And They are the big guys, Vattenfall and EDF and EON and whoever. They should and can have a big and interesting task, and they should collaborate and not work against, as they do today, where they work against local ownership. They do it in Denmark in several projects. Vattenfall works against it, although they say they don't do it. They do it in practice. I know it from detailed studies. And we should not accept that interconnect delays energy sector integration. We should require an honest discussion of what is best and how much integration and how much interconnectors. We should put pressure also on the same companies and on our politicians. So we need an acceptable discussion of this theme so that we know, is it correct that there are problems with, we cannot solve the problems of fluctuating wind power and solar energy by means of interconnectors. We need integration also. We need to have a serious discussion of this. We try to make it to some extent, but it is not really serious. It needs open discussion. We cannot let us delay on and make a mistake. If I'm, for instance, right by saying that building more interconnections is a 4-track blind alley, then they should say, no, you're wrong, and then we have to get a very good discussion of this. And then I would say we need technical analysis, and that's also something for all of you sitting here, that I think that technical analysis very often should be accompanied by policy suggestions and policy discussions, so that they become interdisciplinary. And then I think we cannot, we have not time for one generation solutions. We cannot wait until the next generation. So they will just make the same mistake. I've been around for this, and I recognize many of the arguments from as being the same as 30 years ago. And so we need to have collaboration between the old generation and the young generation. There's not time for just one generation. It's not, for instance, saying, okay, now it's a young, the old generation is needed. All of us are needed, you could say. And then we cannot wait to 100% knowledge before action. And we cannot, there's no time for too expensive corporate solutions. And then the last word on this, and then is that we don't have time for realistic patience. We need impatience. And that's why I would say thank you, all of you, for your impatience.
Thank you, Fred, for excellent talk. And I think we want Fred for president of South European countries because he can solve unemployment problem. I like this very much, that unemployment is a resource that should be used in order to increase the energy efficiency of the buildings. Unfortunately, sometimes it's very hard to find workers for such type of jobs. Unemployed people in Southern Europe usually want jobs where they can drink coffee. That would be your stumbling point as a president of one of those countries, I'm afraid so. But I'm opening now floor for discussion. Željko?
I'm Željko Tomšić from University of Zagreb. Just first comments very similar to yours. I think that the success of this, let's say, principle is strongly dependent of local population, and let's say, I would say that in my country will not succeed, but it doesn't matter. I have two questions. Let's say, first one is, how big are municipalities in Denmark, and basically have you any analysis what will be the minimum of municipality that can survive, let's say, this principle? Because we have this experience with distribution of gas, and today most of these small distributions which are owned by municipality are in minus and try to find somebody to buy them. This is the first question. Let's say, what is the minimum on municipality which can survive? Because there are some investment costs and everything what is needed to maintain let's say, the distribution system. Another is, let's say, what in the case what we have some very rarely populated area. Distribution is very, very expensive. They're long line with very small consumption. And the cost of maintenance, let's say, distribution system costs are much higher than, for example, in Zagreb. There is quarter of population is there, large consumption, and for that, it's question how to deal. If, for example, maybe in some islands also, if they just own, it will be very expensive to have this distribution system. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Yes, thanks a lot. I can only remember one thing. So I remembered your last question with the distribution network. I also remember the first now. I remember.
The size of community.
The last one, that's a political question. Personally, I would say all people in the country should pay the same for the distribution system. So you should not have people living in a distant place where they should pay a huge amount of money for a distribution system. And there are many people living in Sarab, so they have to give subsidies so that you have the same payment for distribution system everywhere in your country. I would say that's my policy, and that's also the tradition, you could say, in the Danish system, where you also have many people living far away from in the countryside, and that's the same price, and it has been in the cooperative system, also for the agricultural cooperative system. If you have only 3 cows, you don't pay more for getting your milk transported to the dairy than if you have 100 cows. So it's a policy question. I think that the whole system gains from having this policy where everybody pays the same. And that's the first thing. And then the second, yes, I'm not a specialist in sizing of distribution system. And I don't know how small you mean small is, but if you take the one I showed up here, it was 212,000 consumers, and it consists of, I don't know it exactly, but I think it consists of 15 old districts, something like this, because it's a conglomerate of many small systems. And so, but these small systems still exist as consumer-owned systems. So if you are in system district A, you have 5 representatives from this district, and you have election next year. And you are from district B, you have election in 2 years from now. So they have found a way of making small, big.
I think the highlight is on a consumer-owned system, not necessarily on the size. The problem in Croatia is that we don't have consumer-owned, we have municipality-owned, which means that municipalities are pushing their relatives into companies, which makes it expensive. Yeah. Yes, and they could be bigger, but still consumer-owned. We had one question there, please.
Hi, Lise Skovsgaard, Danish Technical University. Thank you for your presentation. I think it's very relevant discussion. I think one of the key issues in this suggestion is the risk aversion, and I think if you have this cost of service regulation as you are suggesting, you can reduce the risk because the community would accept more risk than a private investor. On the other hand, the way at least it has been regulated in Denmark until now is it has included a lot of risk aversion, so that small producers or municipalities are not allowed to have accept a lot of risk. And if we want to invest and if we want to be impatient, we should allow for more risk in the current regulation at least. Otherwise, they will not be allowed to invest in these new technologies before knowing what will happen. Do you?
Yes, and it was, I see it as a comment, and I don't know everything about this theme at all, and I don't know exactly municipality risk management. So a broad and a little bit stupid answer would be yes. I think it's a good idea that they get the right to run a bit higher risk. But I think that the municipalities have gained, when we built the big natural gas system, the municipality were giving guarantee to this big system. And I mean, the system now is not much bigger than the investment in the big natural gas network was. So some guarantee, but I'm not a specialist in this area at all, so I only can give a sort of floppy answer.
We had another question here, and then later on, question there.
Albana Kona from European Commission. So thank you, Professor, for your intervention. It's working? Okay. Just to report the Italian case. So what happens to...
Is it taking the microphone?
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
You can take it. So, for example, in Italy, what happens to the distribution operators? They change from natural gas to district heating because big companies who sells natural gas, they are stealing the consumers, the profit from the local ownership, and they are bringing outside the profit. So one method that have been used in Italy is to change distribution operators into district heating networks, because in that way you take money in your local authority. Because local authorities, local utilities are municipality owned in Italy on most cases. Well, this also within the frame of the new directive on renewables and the internal energy market, I think it's going pretty much in the direction that you are saying, that with the concept of the energy communities, which sometimes going from the council to the parliament change between local energy communities, cooperative energy communities, but nevertheless, in the final version, there will be the ability to open the energy market to energy communities, which will be framed as a partnership between local authorities and energy consumers, where more than 50% of the shares should be from the local authority, from the municipality. But we need also the energy consumers. So the utilities that are owned by local authorities should open their shares to the energy consumers, and then will bring us to start the impatient system. And another point, and I will finish. So it's the EU is going into that direction. What we need is capacity building. So you, Professor, our scientists, go and speak to the local authorities and to the regulators and say that this is possible. It has happened in Denmark, and we can make a revolution on this and to enable the energy transition. So thank you.
So you would understand this as a comment also? My question to European Commission: when are we going to understand that there is no place for gas in heating, residential heating? I mean, thermodynamically it doesn't make any sense. But the Dutch have forbidden gas for heating. But what about the other countries? What about European policy?
Okay, I'm not the European Commission. I am Albana Kona, so okay. I don't have that power. So because I'm a scientist supporting with science policy making people. But if you look to the energy roadmap for 2050, the idea is to cut 80% of the emissions, so going from 10 tons per capita to 2 tons per capita by 2050, and this will become available because 80% will be in buildings, energy savings in buildings, and changing from fossil fuels to electricity. So I will use electricity for cooking, electricity for heating, and therefore...
District heating and heat pumps are easy solutions that we can implement immediately. So why don't we implement it? But since you cannot respond as European Commission,
I have a comment.
will ask, there was a question, Stefan there? Yeah? Sorry, maybe you have
I just had a comment to the comment.
Okay, yeah, please.
And that's that in Denmark, we when you make a wind turbine project, the Danish legislation says you have at least to offer 20% of the project to local and regional owners. And we tried, and some, I think it was the Social Democratic Party, tried to elevate this number to 30% should be offered. And I was discussing it a lot with some lawyers, and they would say, and in Denmark we said we are not allowed to give 30% to the local because of the EU. And then I asked lawyers, and they said maybe you are not allowed to give 30%, you might be allowed to give 50%. If you say that it is necessary for the common good. And that's why I said on one of my slides, I don't know exactly what the EU rules are. Is it possible to say, to make a national rule, we want all our wind turbine projects, we have a rule where it's 51% that has to be given locally. Do you think this is possible with the present legislation?
Will be present from in 2 or 3 months with the update of the Renewable Energy Directive, the internal market directive.
You think so? Yeah.
I hope.
Yes, we both hope. Yeah.
So the question there.
Stefan Petrovic from Technical University of Denmark. Stefan Petrovic from Technical University of Denmark. I'll have 2 short questions. One is, I can see that you rely heavily on district heating. What should the countries without district heating do? That's one. And the other, I just multiplied very quickly in my head, if we need 10 gigawatts of wind in Denmark in 2050, and if the normal people should finance that, and not the big companies, that's a lot of money. And the bigger problem is that in the municipalities where you can install wind turbines, there are not so many rich people, and as in municipalities where you basically cannot install wind turbines. So do you think, in my opinion, it would be like a big constraint to the transition if the normal people are supposed to finance everything and not the companies? But I'm asking for your opinion.
Yes, first of all, the companies pay nothing. All the money the companies pay, they will get back from the consumers. So it's not so that they have a basket of money and we will pay it for you, dear consumers. So it's at the end of the day, it's always the consumers paying it. And the second thing is that we have had a very big project with near-shore wind turbines. We did not succeed, I was not a member, a company called Wind and Welfare tried to make a near-shore project, and they did not find it problematic to get the money because the consumers at the end of the day always have to pay it, so they can easily collect a lot of money. And I don't have the exact data from another project in close to Struer in the middle of the back of Jutland, and but they, I'm sure maybe some of you have the numbers, I don't have them, but they had a lot of money. You can collect a lot of money quickly from the consumer. So I think this money collection problem is not a big problem in Denmark. But then the first question, what was, please say, I didn't hear it because the microphone did not work.
Countries that don't have district heating?
Yes, that's easy. They should build district heating.
Cooling is also a good solution. If you don't need heating, you need cooling.
Yes, and then I would say, linked to this, that the EU Commission should, as they now give subsidies to infrastructure, interconnectors, they should also have a policy where they give a similar amount of subsidies to establishment of integration in district heating systems. So.
Okay, I would like to close now discussion, and I have a certificate for you for the presentation. And thank you very much for your excellent talk.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.